paying attention to the chat window or more of a request. I know that Lauren has already volunteered to do this, but definitely if there are a lot of questions, I don't know exactly how many there will be. And I know that Jeremy will try and pause at different times just to check. But if I'm missing something, you know, I haven't moderated chat in for 2 hours before, so definitely hoping that others here on the Ross team and others who are part of our team can be watching. And if you see things that I'm missing, please either private chat them or text me. And Mark, I'm hoping you can help me with this too. I see you're there, right? You're there, Mark?
I'm here.
Okay. I think the challenge with this, like any facilitation, is going to be grouping like comments if possible, and that sometimes is really difficult to do when the chat window is scrolling. So I will take any help if I'm not on top of it.
I'm also not going to be able to take note just with the presentation maximized on my computer. So
right.
If you, Eileen, or Mark are able to take notes, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to try. I'm going to try very hard to take as many notes as I can along the way. But yeah, Mark, if you could back up on that too, that would help enormously.
Yeah, we're recording this, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Eileen, this is Andy. I'm going to stop my video. We could probably both just stop our videos. I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. I think I'm going to be introducing at the beginning. Should I have video on for that, or should I keep it off?
Good question.
I'm happy to keep it off. Should I try and get rid of that picture?
I think it's fine.
I meant to do that, but I forgot.
Hey, Mark, we're picking up some background from you.
Tom, it looks like you're on. Or do you have audio?
Yeah, this is Tom.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. I don't know why it was hard to get on.
Heather, why don't you let us know when to kick things off?
I would say now it's 10 o'clock and it looks like we have all of our panelists and we're live on YouTube, so we're all set.
Great. All right. Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is Tom Byerly with Ross Strategic. I just want to say a couple things before we get started here, and then I'll turn it over to Eileen Quigley with the Clean Energy Transition Institute. This is the first of 2 webinars that we'll be holding in May on deep decarbonization pathways analysis. And we have participants both from the advisory committee working on the Washington State energy strategy, as well as people who are likely to be involved in the technical advisory process. We also have the leads from the Department of Commerce and the governor's office on the line as well. In addition to folks participating as attendees in the webinar, we're also live streaming on YouTube through the Department of Commerce YouTube channel. And the webinar will be recorded and posted. So if people are not able to stay on for the entire time, we'll have that recording of it. As we go through the webinar today, the main way to ask questions and be engaged in the conversation is through the chat function in Zoom. So as folks are hearing the presentation and have questions that come up or thoughts that come up, please go ahead and chat those in, and we'll take some breaks over the course of the webinar to be able to address those. If we're not able to address all the questions during the time today, we'll be able to follow up with a Q&A from that. So why don't I go ahead then and turn it over to Eileen Quigley with the Clean Energy Transition Institute to introduce the topic for the call today. And I'd say if anybody's having any technical difficulties, feel free to chat us behind the scenes. So Eileen, turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today. As Tom mentioned, this is the first of 2 webinars that the Clean Energy Transition team will be presenting and that Jeremy Hargreaves will be presenting from Evolved Energy Research. This webinar is going to offer a deep dive into the deep decarbonization pathways modeling that Evolved performs. We'll be covering model methodology, assumptions, and how key results are used to inform policy development. And specifically will be used when we develop the scenarios for Washington. The webinar also is going to introduce the concept of scenario development and how scenarios are used to determine preferred approaches for achieving state carbon reduction goals. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy Hargreaves, a principal with Evolved Energy Research.
Thanks for that introduction, Eileen. So as Eileen mentioned, this is a deep dive to look under the hood of the models that we use and how those models are going to fit into the planning process, how they inform us in developing the state energy strategy. So the way that I've structured this presentation is first to just take a look back at the high-level introduction that we gave on the previous advisory committee meeting on planning framework. How does this modeling activity fit into the development of the state energy strategy as a whole? Then I'll look at a model overview from a high level, 10,000-foot view of what we're trying to accomplish with the model, what are we at, and then get into some of the actual under the hood elements of the two models that we're using, model structure and operations, the key components of capturing a deeply decarbonized system in the future and coming up with realistic solutions to getting there. A look at reliability in the electricity system. Reliability is a tough thing to capture once we get into high renewables, deeply decarbonized system, and just talk a little bit about how we treat that in the model and how we ensure that we're building a reliable system as well as a clean system. And then sourcing the data, looking at where we're getting the data from and what our philosophy is behind that. And then, as Eileen said, key results, how do those fit into informing us in the policy and action development beyond this modeling step? And then finally, the topic of the next presentation, the next workshop, is on the scenarios that we're going to model in this work. So I want to introduce some of the concepts about how we're thinking about scenarios, how they are structured, and what we want to accomplish with those.
Jeremy, just a quick thing before you go forward. Your audio is at times muffling and kind of coming in and out. So I'm not sure if that's proximity to the mic or if it's just a bandwidth issue, but a couple of comments have come up about that. So try to see if you can
I'm
maybe
not
move.
sure
That's
what I
better.
can do about that.
That's better.
It is?
Yeah, that's
I think
better.
that's just the
Hey,
same as what I was doing before, so
Okay, well then
it
it
might
may
go
be a
out again.
bandwidth. Okay,
But I'll try and talk more loudly.
okay, thank you.
Okay, so before getting into the planning framework itself, I want to just revisit some of the goals for the project here. And when we're thinking about modeling a decarbonized energy system that's reaching such aggressive goals, and the goals for Washington State are shown there on the right-hand side, 95% below 1990 emissions by 2050, net zero by 2050. What we're looking at here is transformational change rather than incremental change. This is going to need really aggressive action across energy sectors. And there's a lot of different ways that we could get to those goals in the future. So we're designing this process around identifying what the best path forward is for the state. And that best path forward is based on the priorities of developing policy: equity, affordability, reliability, competitiveness. So our goal here in modeling the system and looking at different options is to try and explore what the trade-offs are between those different pathways and what the sort of economic counterpoint or additional information that we can add into that policy development process. It's building on a foundation of past studies and efforts in other states and also in the region and in Washington State itself. And we're using what we think are the best tools to try and explore this problem going to such aggressive targets in the future. The approach that we're taking is using conservative assumptions about existing technology from public sources. So our design philosophy there is not to be trying to factor in a lot of different technologies that are unproven or we think may come down the pipeline in the future. Instead, we're taking projected costs of technologies that exist today and using those to forecast what we might invest in the future. We're exploring how Washington can achieve deep decarbonization in all energy sectors. So this is looking across all of those traditionally potentially segregated sections of the economy or siloed in terms of planning, and thinking about this holistically. What do we need to prioritize? What do we do in different areas of the economy? We're using an optimal investment model. So how do we minimize costs while meeting the objectives of different scenarios? And we are looking at the model interaction with other states. So how does Washington make decisions in the context of the Western region and in the context of the West, making moves themselves towards deep decarbonization or high renewable systems. There's a lot of studies that have already been done in decarbonization, both in the US, in the Northwest, in Washington, and internationally. And this has been a process of development of understanding the different elements of decarbonizing our economies and learning from that past work on what types of strategy might be appropriate to get to these goals in the future and get to those goals while meeting the objectives of different planning entities, of different states, of different countries. What we see when we look at the literature out there, and we have the Clean Energy Transition Institute has a review out of 58 different studies reviewed. Jesse Jenkins at Princeton reviewed 30 different studies, and subsequently there have been a number of studies done since those reviews. What we see across all of them are commonalities in the types of strategy, the types of action that we might take to achieve decarbonization in the future. Just looking back from Jim Williams' paper published in Science in 2012, energy efficiency, generation, decarbonization, and electrification were three key pillars of reaching a decarbonized future. California E3 GHG scenario results in 2015. We see the same sort of pillars identified there as well. Efficiency and conservation, fuel switching, which is a broader term for electrification, decarbonized electricity and decarbonized fuels. Then risk to return, risky business study in 2016, we see the same thing. The 350 ppm study looking at how the United States might get to 1 degree warming by 2100. Again, those same pillars, but with carbon capture now. And then for the Northwest, the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Study, we see the same kind of pillars, the same strategies coming up again. So this is something that across studies, there's some relative agreement about the areas that we need to focus on to get to these decarbonization goals. But depending on the region, the focus changes depending on what the resource potentials look like, what policies look like, what loads look like, and how we expect those to evolve over time. So reviewing the planning framework, this is going to be material familiar to people that saw the previous workshop presentation. Why model the future energy system? What value is this giving to us when we're thinking about developing a state energy strategy? We're developing a tailored analytical approach for Washington State, looking at least cost energy system planning and policy action design. And those really complement one another, because the least cost energy system planning can guide the policy and action design, making sure that we are on the right path towards that future that we want. And one thing that I think is often misinterpreted in this type of definition is least cost. I think that people instantly go to thinking about this in terms of, okay, we're throwing out everything apart from our economic objectives here, potentially at the expense of other objectives in the state or in the country. And really, least cost is a definition of what the model is doing, but the process itself is looking beyond that. What we're looking for here in developing the scenarios and running the model is the best path as a balance of different, often competing objectives. And not all of those objectives can be quantified in economic terms. So by developing different scenarios and constraining the model in different ways, we can find the least cost path through that particular scenario or that particular pathway that meets the objectives of the state or meets a particular type of prioritization of state objectives, so that we can allow decision makers to weigh one option against another, look at the trade-offs, look at the economic counterpoints of different options. And this is where the advisory committee and technical advisory process is essential to help us define the different options for the state and define those scenarios that we want to explore that are going to best inform policy and action development. There are three framing questions which help sort of orientate us to what's going on with model, what's going on with policy and action development. The first is, where are we now? So where are we starting from? What is the current state of Washington's energy system? Where do we want to go? So from here, the jumping off point, how do we then move to our emission reductions goals in the future? What's the most desirable pathways to meeting those? And then finally, how should we get there? So once we've looked at what those pathways might be, we can think about what policies and actions might get us to where we want to go. So starting from where we are now, we have Washington and WEC current energy resources and infrastructure, and that includes the stock of all energy producing and consuming technologies in the region, patterns of energy consumption, final energy demand of fuels and electricity, the electricity system itself, all of the resources, transmission, and then fuel prices and fuel sources. And then we have policy as well, existing policy and targets through 2030, through 2050. The Clean Energy Transformation Act being an example of one of those for Washington that are already setting out goals for us to achieve in that time frame. Where do we want to go? We're envisioning the best future for the state. And by looking at different scenarios, we're balancing different competing objectives, equity, affordability, reliability, competitiveness, and examining different priorities in achieving this least cost, or sorry, decarbonized future by 2050. And we're understanding the trade-offs. So how much does one pathway cost versus the other, providing that target for policy and action design to hit. And we're understanding the uncertainties as well. So how does an uncertain future impact our decisions? The right-hand side here shows examples of policies we might investigate, examples of uncertainties we might investigate that could be explored through scenario development. Then how do we get there? This is the interfacing of modeling with the on the ground. We actually have to do. Yeah.
Sorry, you just faded out entirely there. So, okay, keep going.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, but it goes in and out, but keep going.
I can try switching to a different microphone.
It might be worth it.
Hold on 1 second.
The other possibility, Jeremy, is to have you switch to the phone if a different mic doesn't work.
Yeah.
That sounds better though.
Is this better?
That's much better now. Let's try that.
Okay.
And then I think also after you get through these questions, we have some questions in the chat. So we'll want to take a few of them before we keep going.
Okay, we're a couple of slides away from the end of the section, so we can stop there. So how do we get there? We're looking to develop and prioritize near-term policies and actions. And this is where our scenarios and the outputs of the modeling can inform what types of actions we take and what types of actions we take in each sector. One thing that I think is key to remember here is that we're not prescribing actions over the next 30 years. We're not targeting a specific set of investments based on the outputs of these models, but we're trying to provide the best guidance given the current information and uncertainties on what we do now. What kind of decisions do we take in the near term, understanding that in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, we'll have a lot more information about the future beyond that than we do currently today. So this is a process of iteration and planning where we understand uncertainties grow with time, and that we'll understand more about our systems, our technologies as time progresses into the future. When we talk about near-term actions, what we're thinking about is no regrets sort of solutions where we want to be certain that decisions that we take now are going to be useful regardless of how things develop given the uncertainties that we might experience. A key area for that is replacing and avoiding long-lived resources, and we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. And then early action on long lead time or hard to achieve energy transformations, things that we might need to put in place or hurdles we need to overcome by a certain date in the future in order to enable us to invest in or use different technologies or implement different kinds of programs on the demand side. So a note on replacing or avoiding long-lived resources. This figure here shows us a simple example of what that means. With a light bulb, we may have many bites at the apple between now and 2050 in replacing that bulb with something more efficient. Appliances, we maybe have 2 or 3 opportunities, ACs and furnaces, less vehicles, 1 or 2 opportunities. And then we get into things like commercial boilers, power plants, pipelines, transmission lines, that if we build them now, there's a good chance that they will still be there in 2050. And so, you know, we understand that our system and the dynamics of that system are going to change dramatically over the course of that time. And we need to make sure that the investments that we make now serve us over the lifetime of those technologies. So I'll stop there and take any questions at this point.
Okay, so from Clay Norris, does your model consider incentives needed to stimulate market transformation of key technologies?
So that's actually a really good question, because it gets at the heart of the philosophy of the model. What we're looking at when we're modeling demand side and supply side investments is not what will result from incentives that we put in place now. It's trying to identify what the least cost investments will look like based on a total resource cost perspective. So that means, what is the size of the total pie in terms of all of the investments in different technologies that we're making? And that identifies for us what are the least cost set of investments we'd like to make. What do we want to incentivize to happen in the economy? And maybe without putting incentives in, we wouldn't be able to achieve that. So incentives are a mechanism for achieving the solution rather than driving the solution forward from the beginning in the model. So we don't represent those incentives unless they're outside of the region that we're talking about. So if we know there'll be a federal incentive that will be beneficial to Washington State, then we would include that. If it were a Washington-based incentive where it's taxpayer money going towards investing in different technologies, that wouldn't be included because we're actually using the model itself to determine whether that incentive is needed and how much that incentive would need to be.
Okay, and then Sandy wanted to see a slide. We should go back. Maybe let's try going back 3. not quite sure, hang on, which one it is. Sandy, so the 100%, yeah. So I think we hit it. Yes. Okay, so this is the slide. And I think the one point that needs to be made, because there are a couple of questions about this in the chat, the examples on the right are purely examples. These are not scenarios that we're running in the Washington state strategy. We haven't determined them yet. This is just an example of the types of either policies or uncertainties that could be run. So I don't know if Sandy, you had more question about it, but that's what those are, just that's what that's for. And there was another question about that. Let's see. To Clay Norris, does the model look at electric fuels as an alternative to biofuels? We'll definitely get into that later. Jeremy, I don't know if you want to just mention the electric fuels piece here.
Yeah, we definitely get into that, and the model optimally invests in the infrastructure needed for electric fuels economy, and we do have a section on that we'll go into more detail on.
Okay, and from George Kahn, we have a very specific metric to measure carbon reduction goals to do an optimization study. What are the metrics that are going to be used to compare objectives with respect to affordability, equity, reliability, and competitiveness? If there are not metrics associated with these objectives, how can we do a useful analysis?
So that's definitely something that's necessary in evaluating the different pathways to understand what we're trading off against. We may have an economic result from running the model here, and that is traded off against the other objectives that may be non-economic or difficult to quantify in economic terms. And so there needs to be an evaluation of what that means. But that's something that we're going to cover later. It's related to policy and action development. And so that'll come up in a future workshop.
Although the reliability piece is definitely something you're going to discuss as we keep going.
And
so there's a whole section
on reliability.
Right.
We maintain reliability as we have it today. So we're modeling to ensure that we have a reliable system in the future as we have right now.
Okay, I'm going to do one more for now, and then we'll keep going, and then we'll come back to the one that came in at 10:23. Energy consumption varies greatly by region within Washington state. How will that be considered?
So the consumption patterns of the state as a whole are aggregated in our model. We're not breaking out different transmission zones, for example. But what we are doing is capturing this state as a whole in terms of technology stocks and how those technology stocks will evolve over time. So if there are differences in, as there are differences in energy consumption by region within the state, all of those are taken account for when we're building the demand for electricity, the demand for gas, the demand for petroleum products in serving the economy.
Okay, let's go forward, and then we'll add some more in a bit when you take your next break.
Okay, so next section here is the 10,000 foot view of what we're trying to achieve and what is the process that we're following with the model. And so taking the very high level view here, what we're doing first of all is modeling Washington's economy. So that's that first bucket where we have residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation demands for energy. And in this bucket, we're looking at the bottom-up stocks of all energy consuming technologies in the economy.
Your audio just paused. So repeat what you just said, please.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. So we're taking a bottom-up approach of every energy consuming technology and unit of that technology in the economy to build up a picture of how much we're consuming today, and then using forecasts and assumptions about how those stocks will change over time to get a picture of what we'll be consuming in the future. And we'll get into this in the data sources section, but we're making a bunch of assumptions here about what kind of technologies people will replace their existing technologies with as they burn out. So when your water heater burns out, what kind of new water heater do you replace it with? When you're buying a new car, what kind of new car do you replace it with? And that gives us this evolution of energy needs in the economy. The second bucket is the aggregation of that. So in Washington, how much electricity in total do we need? How many liquid fuels, how many gaseous fuels, and when do we need those things? And then the final bucket there, supply energy reliably at least cost. This is our supply side solution, where we're looking at how do we serve the economy in the most efficient way, constrained by our clean energy goals? What kind of investments do we need to make in our supply side infrastructure in order to be able to achieve our goals and also produce all of this energy that Washington needs? As an example of that first step, the model of Washington's economy going to Washington's energy needs, we look at water heaters in the residential sector. Starting on the left-hand side there, we have purchased hot water heaters. So this is an assumption about what kind of water heater people are buying in every year going into the future to replace their burned out water heaters. And you can see the shift from gas and electric resistance to heat pump water heaters. So by 2050, we have about 50% sales of heat pump water heaters. That translates into a water heater stock over time. So with the growth of population, we see a growth in the total number of water heaters, but we also see heat pumps coming into the residential sector. And that has an impact on the energy demands. So energy demand is shown in the final chart there. We see pipeline gas decreasing significantly as more heat pumps are being injected into that stock, into the residential sector. And that gives us the energy demand that we then need to serve with our supply side. And this stock rollover analysis is done for about 30 end uses across the economy. We have about 70 end uses in total represented. Not all of them have enough data for this kind of detailed analysis, but from those 70, we build up a picture of what our demand side energy demands look like. Then that number 2 step, model calculates energy supply. We can look here at an example just for electricity. And when we're running the model, it's optimizing across all of the supply side, fuels allocation, synthetic fuels production, electricity. Just looking only at electricity here, the left-hand chart there shows electricity demand, and you see transportation increasing significantly in this case because of assumptions about electrification of vehicles. Then we work out how do we serve that demand while meeting our emissions targets. And you see growth in renewable power plants here, reduction in gas burn by 2050, coal phasing out, all elements of this example. And the model is calculating how these investments are made at least cost while also maintaining system reliability. The 70 demand subsectors include, well, we have a full list of them at the end of the presentation for those interested and more of a reference, I think. But the major energy sectors are shown here for residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. And then on the supply side, we're looking at a variety of different resources that we can invest in. And so simple list here of example technologies is shown for thermal. We have gas turbines, gas combined cycle, gas with CCS, renewable resources, energy storage. And then supply side fuel options fall into these buckets: diesel fuel, jet fuel, pipeline gas, liquid hydrogen, gasoline, steam, and all of these have options for clean types of fuel and fuels that can be created either from biomass or synthetic production from hydrogen electrolysis in the electricity sector. And we'll get into a bit more detail about how this all links together in the next section. So I'll stop there and take any questions on that high level overview.
Okay, so from an anonymous attendee, energy resource planning at a macro level often assumes away the fact that resource decisions are made at the level of the firm and often include previous investments. Will this be included in this modeling effort?
So this is also something that in running our models, we're kind of bypassing that step, but it's also intentional in that we are not trying to simulate the investments that would be made in a current market. We are trying to model least cost investments in different types of technology based on their costs alone and their optimal operations together. And it may not be the case that existing markets and existing incentives will produce a least cost outcome or a decarbonized future. And so the dynamics at the firm level and in current markets will need to be influenced by potentially action or policy development that steers it towards the ideal outcome in the future. And so we're trying to get away from looking at that near term or market-based simulation and think more about markets and the current incentive environment as a set of tools. You know, markets are there to operate our system in the way that we want them to. And those tools may have to be used in terms of changing markets, changing incentives to be able to get to the market and the system that we want in the future. And so we're trying to disconnect simulating where markets would take us right now from where we want to go and think about how do we want to evolve the markets themselves or evolve incentive structures to get there.
Another question, are the choices in technology in the model informed by different climates in different parts of the state? E.g. heat pumps may not be as readily adopted in colder areas.
Yeah, so our technology databases are climate specific. So the costs and the load shapes and the efficiencies have climate specific inputs, and those are represented in our database. And so those are costed out when we're building these different scenarios.
Okay. For the water heater example from Clay Norris, are any assumptions made about the new construction options? Is there a building code halting new gas connections?
That's a question that I think we need to think about in scenario development,
Right.
because if it's influential on how rapidly we can adopt new types of technology, then it's going to be a barrier to getting rapid adoption that maybe we would have otherwise wanted. I don't know. But those kind of barriers to adoption are things that we need to think about when building scenarios, and also when thinking about policy and action development, because they might be things that we want to try and accelerate or try and remove those barriers if it's economically or otherwise advantageous for the state to do so.
Okay. I'm going to take two more that are similar, and then we'll come back. From Marty Gibbons, is nuclear excluded from the options? And then from George Kahn, does the model include and environmental or cost impacts of energy density. For instance, a non-emitting nuclear power plant with a high capacity factor has a different environmental and cost impact than a variable emitting wind farm.
To answer the second question first, the environmental impacts are not costed in the model. So it's actually a broader point to make, that we're not factoring in the environmental impact costs into the final cost of the scenario. We're also not factoring in the social cost of carbon. We're not factoring in potential health benefit costs or health benefits from reducing emissions. So the solution is purely just the cost of the technology and the cost of the fuels being used in the economy. That's not to say that we can't then layer those on afterwards and look at potentially what the costs of those elements are.
Right.
But
and also that's what we're planning to do also. So I
Right.
think that's, yeah, just to be clear, just because this particular part of the project doesn't, that doesn't mean that this overall technical advisory process is not going to consider it. We'll just be using different tools. And then is nuclear excluded from the options?
so nuclear can be included. It's just a question of what we include in the scenarios.
Right.
So if we wanted to look at a SMR scenario, for example, then we can include that. It's just a question of what are the assumptions.
Okay. All right. I think I saw one other, but disappearing now. So, okay, let's keep going.
Okay, so this next section is getting into more detail about the key components of our models that are useful for modeling these highly decarbonized or highly renewable systems. We use two models. One is called Energy Pathways, and the other one is the Regional Investment and Operations Model, RIO. Energy Pathways is our demand side model, where we're doing that stock rollover dynamic. We're looking at the lifetime of different technologies, the distribution of how many technologies remain in the economy and when they're going to burn out, be replaced, and what they're being replaced with. So this is our detailed bottom-up energy accounting model that's looking at how much energy are we consuming in the economy based on the technologies and their lifetimes and what we're replacing them with, and what the shape of that consumption looks like. When are we consuming it? What do the hourly load shapes look like? And that produces a set of aggregated energy demands that then goes into our supply side model, which is RIO. And the supply side model is looking at all of the various different ways that we could serve those energy supply needs of the economy, and what the least cost way of doing that is, given all those options and the constraints on the particular scenario that we're running. RIO and Energy Pathways have been used in many studies over time. And the current iteration of those models is not what we started with. We've learned a lot along the way over the years of developing them. And where we are right now, State of Washington, State Energy Strategy at the bottom of this list, this is the latest set of tools with the latest data and the functionality that we've developed to get realistic solutions to decarbonization in the future. Looking at decision variables and outputs, we model on an hourly basis, daily basis, and annual basis, all part of the same optimization model, because these temporal frames are what's important for us to be able to capture the dynamics in the system and be able to realistically develop and optimize a least cost resource portfolio going out into the future. So hourly decision variables include generator dispatch, transmission flows, operating reserves, curtailment, load flexibility. Those elements of an hourly optimization, like a production cost model, that are important for capturing the challenges of balancing a system and incorporating more renewables. Then daily, what becomes increasingly important with more renewables is this, this longer term balance. And the Northwest and Washington are familiar with this already with large hydro resources and hydro availability over the course of the year. In the daily element, then we're looking at fuels, energy balance and storage, long duration electricity storage. You know, when we have storm events that shut down renewable production for several days, how do we deal with those kind of persistent conditions? And then annual, over years, we're looking at emissions from operations, RPS, supply and demand, capacity build, retirement, repowering of generators, those kind of long-term infrastructure decisions that are part of optimizing a least cost resource portfolio. Looking at how this operates all together, what the model does, and I think it's important just to lay out, first of all, that capacity expansion modeling is limited by the computational power of the computers that exist today. And to capture the full problem, we would need infinite computing capabilities. So every model out there that looks at these long-term planning questions is trying to get as much out of the processing power we have available as possible. So what our model does is it takes 40 to 60 daily snapshots from the historical data that are identified through different clustering algorithms to capture the full range of conditions that we might experience in the system. High renewables, low renewables, high load, low load, hydro conditions, all of those kind of things factor into what are those daily snapshots that we're modeling. Then those daily snapshots are projected back onto the 365 days of the year by taking the day that is closest to the day in the time series, so that we can model that persistence as well. If we have storm conditions that last for a week, then that will be represented in the 365-day time series. And that allows us to do things like daily fuels tracking, which is shown in the bottom chart there. That's daily hydrogen production, where we might be producing more during times of high renewables, high hydro, less during periods of low renewables, low hydro. And then over the course of the 30 years of the model, then we're looking at capacity build decisions. And we have a separate set of daily snapshots, a separate set of 365 chronological series that represent each year modeled. So that's the timescale granularity. We're also looking across geographic granularity as well. We represent each state in the West and the transmission constraints and potential for transmission expansion between those states, as well as the cost of doing that expansion. And then by state, we have load resource and new resource potentials according to the conditions of that state, the weather conditions, the climate, the loads. So it captures the unique geographic advantages and the local conditions that allow us to potentially get geographic diversity, take advantage of, in the West here, excellent solar resource in the southwest, and excellent wind resource in the north. We have flexible load operations. So there are a number of technologies that we can install in the future, technologies that are replacing those that are burning out over time, that have flexible load capabilities. One of them that's very valuable to balancing the grid would be industrial boiler loads that could be shifted a little bit over the course of the day. So on the left-hand side there, we have a delay advance flexible load shape construct, which is kind of typical of characterizing a daily flexible load resource. And this is converted into cumulative energy constraints, where we have an envelope on what we can be producing, either more or less during every hour. And we have to meet that same energy budget over the course of the day. This is also true of longer term resources as well. We develop this flexible load envelope. And then economic generator life cycles. What the model is doing is ensuring that generators that are valuable to the system, that they're in this chart, energy capacity AS value shown by the dotted yellow line. If it's higher than a new plant cost in the beginning, plus fixed O&M, then the model will invest in that. If the model comes to the end of its life, it could be economically retired by the model along that timeline. But if it gets to the end of its life and there's the option for extending the life of that resource with additional investment, then as long as energy capacity AS is still higher than the cost of that life extension, then the generator will continue. There's also the option of retiring a generator, and then as long as we're within specific conditions, time frame, say within 5 years or whatever we want to define that as, we can repower that resource if it becomes valuable again in the future. And then retirement is based on either the lifetime of the resource, or if that resource is no longer valuable and the fixed O&M costs are exceeding the value of that resource, then the model will retire it. One of the key advantages of our model is electricity and fuel sector integration. Traditional capacity expansion has been focused on the electricity sector, and by combining fuels allocation, fuels production, and across the entire energy supply side, then we can explore some cheaper and more realistic solutions to getting to a decarbonized future. So I think I'll go into a few slides just to talk about why that is. And it's about balancing the grid as well as decarbonizing fuels and decarbonizing the economy. Daily energy imbalances look something like this. On the left-hand side, conceptually, we have load peaking in the evening, renewables peaking in the middle of the day. And this is the inconvenience of renewables. We can't match exactly the production shape with our load. And this is already something that happens in a variety of different regions that have installed a lot of renewables already. We need to disconnect instantaneous load and supply. Currently in this shape, we have over-generation conditions, we have energy deficit periods, and this is opportunities for installing storage. Lithium-ion batteries are a solution to this. We can also try and shift our load towards the renewable shape by flexible loads. This is also something that happens on a longer than a daily time period. So this is also something that happens more and more as we decarbonize our system when we build more renewables. The charts at the bottom there show for the Eastern Interconnect a simulated 40% solar, 60% wind system where our load and renewable energy is equal. So load is shown on the positive side of the chart on the left. And you can see that load is higher in the middle of the year and lower in the winter. And then renewables, it's harder to see, but we have variable renewable production shown in the orange chart on the bottom there. If we subtract our renewables from load, then we get the cumulative net load, and we have surplus energy in the winter and energy deficit in the summer. So this is this year by year seasonal weather condition that will influence how much energy is available at different times of the year. We have a variety of ways that we can deal with this, and it depends on the cost of various different solutions. So the first one there is clean energy mix. We could build different amounts of solar, different amounts of wind, and it may more closely approximate what our annual load shape looks like. We could build battery storage or long-term storage. We could build dispatchable generation to inject energy into those periods where we have an energy deficit. We could build transmission to be able to take advantage of geographic diversity and try and level out that imbalance between load and renewables. And then we have flexible loads. Flexible loads are typically thought of as a diurnal resource where we can shift our air conditioning loads, we can shift our boiler loads, but flexible loads extend to large industrial loads as well. And one of those large industrial loads that's potentially a very valuable resource in the future is production of fuels. We have to decarbonize our transportation sector. We have to decarbonize other sectors that use fuels as their primary energy source. And one of the ways to do that in harder to decarbonize areas is to decarbonize the fuels that they use. And so flexible loads can do double duty here. They can help balance our electricity grid, and they can also help us avoid having to buy fossil fuels in primary fuel use parts of the economy. So what RIO does is optimally invests in fuels, transportation, storage, and conversion infrastructure. This is a simple high-level diagram of the fuels component of the model, where a blend fuel is something like pipeline gas that is used for demand from electric generators. It's used for demand for fuel conversion processes. So this could be hydrogen, for example, and hydrogen is then converted into synthetic methane or synthetic liquids. And it also serves exogenous demand. So each step of this fuels process has some infrastructure associated with it. It has storage, transportation costs, and all of those are represented in the model so that we can build out optimal portfolios of fuels infrastructure alongside the electricity system and get to that least cost or best pathway to decarbonizing the energy supply side. And what that leads to is an integrated supply side between electricity and fuels, where conventional balancing might not be the most economic option. And we're now extending electricity into fuels production. The right-hand side diagram here is from the Northwest DDP study, where we have electricity production going to electrolysis, producing hydrogen, and hydrogen could have taken one of two paths in that study, either methanation or Fischer-Tropsch to produce synthetic liquid fuels. And that fed back into the economy and can decarbonize different sectors in the economy. So I'll pause there and open up for questions before diving into reliability.
Okay, from Dan Kirshner, does the model consider technologies like gas heat pumps and micro CHP, combined heat and power?
Yes, so those are represented in the model. The degree to which we adopt them as new technologies in the future is based on an assumption. And so exploring scenarios that include those technologies would be a design choice in scenario development.
Great. From Clay Norris, is transmission expansion in the model constrained by the decades-long process to get it built?
That's a great question. And And that gets back to what I was discussing in the introduction section, where there are potentially things that we would like down the road that could reduce our costs of our future decarbonized energy system. One of those is transmission expansion. And transmission expansion often takes 10, 15 years to get a new pathway developed. And so if we've identified transmission expansion that comes in 2030, 2035, that may be something that we want to consider getting a head start on in current planning cycles, because it takes so long to get through that process. And that's, you could extend that also to think about renewables, where the quantity of renewables that we need to build in getting to a fully decarbonized economy is really significant and is likely to experience a lot of challenges in the permitting, in the transmission and corridor development in state to be able to develop all of those renewables. And those are the kind of issues that even if we're not building all of those right now, we might want to start the process of thinking about how do we facilitate the building of those renewables in a rapid way in order to get where we want to go in the future.
Right. From Annabelle Drayton, does Energy Pathways look at optimized demand management? And also, does RIO look at changes in weather patterns due to climate change and the impact on hydro and wind output?
So Energy Pathways is not optimizing the investment in new technologies. So demand management technologies, those would be part of a scenario description to say that people are replacing their boilers with flexible boilers that can now participate in grid operations. RIO takes from Energy Pathways how many boilers are available and how many flexible load technologies are available in total, and it optimally dispatches those resources.
And then
There
the
was a second
weather patterns. So how does
Yeah.
the modeling in general deal with the weather patterns due to climate change impact on the resources?
Yeah, so we haven't factored that into past modeling efforts so far. And the main reason for that is just data availability. How do we think hydro is going to change over time? It's definitely something that we can look at, but we would need to do some work on the data development side to understand how we think hydro might be impacted by climate over the next 30 years.
So from Marty Gibbons, does the modeling consider electricity exchange balancing with Canada?
Yes, it does. So we represent the transmission corridors between each of the states and going north in the WEC as well. And we're assuming that the system is optimally dispatched. So we're using that transmission and resource diversity to greatest effect, which may not be in the near term representative of the constraints across those transmission lines.
Mm-hmm. From Dan Kirshner, what does the model assume about the duration of battery storage? Would you provide examples of long-term storage?
Yeah, so the duration of battery storage is optimally invested in. So the model is optimizing the capacity and duration of the batteries that it builds. The long-term storage is something that if there is a technology that can provide low-cost energy storage, then it will be built out in larger amounts. Lithium ion typically gets built to the 6 to 7 hour duration kind of time frame. What we have typically seen in past model results is that gas is used for capacity, where in the periods where we have less renewable output because of a persistent storm or some other condition that makes wind availability or solar availability less over a period of 3, 5, 7 days, then gas is used as an injection of energy during those time periods. And by the time we get to a fully decarbonized system, what we're burning is 100% decarbonized gas. And that's a very expensive fuel. But because we burn it in very low quantities, it turns out to be cheaper than the alternative investment in large amounts of battery storage infrastructure. But that's really dependent on the assumptions about what kind of storage technologies are available. And we have projections of costs going out to 2050 for our different storage technologies. The model makes that trade-off between the different options.
Great. I'm going to take 2 more and then we'll move on. Does the model consider any additional hydro storage? Can the model show if we could add another 10% to our hydro system storage or load following? Would this be a better alternative to batteries or additional generator dispatch? And this is from George Kahn.
Yeah, so if we had the the data on what the additional capacity is, sorry, just got a phone call. So if we had data that characterized what the expansion in capacity looks like and the cost of that, then we can definitely factor that into the sorry, someone was calling me over and over. So if we have the data that characterizes that additional investment, then we can definitely include it in the model, and the model will trade that off against the alternatives. Mm-hmm. So we can look at that.
Since hydro in the Columbia, this is from Alex Ybarra, since hydro in the Columbia Basin is key firm energy and the most abundant energy source, how does the model take into account the very variable water flow, high flow, low flow years from year to year of the Columbia River system?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we take multiple hydro years. In the previous Northwest DDP study, we took 3 years, high hydro, low hydro, and normal hydro year. And we characterized the ability to shift hydro production during those years based on the historical operations of the hydro system. And so characterizing the flexibility of that is based on historical operations.
Okay. All right, let's keep going.
Okay, so next section is taking a look at the reliability criteria in the model, the way that we model reliability in the electricity system. And modeling reliability, it becomes a lot trickier when we're thinking about a deeply decarbonized and highly renewable system in the future. Just looking first at the contrast between what our traditional reserve margin problem look like versus a future system reliability assessment. On the left-hand side here, if we think about a traditional system of thermal generation with gas and coal generators, the problem was really working out what the outage rate was on the portfolio system, what the dependable availability of nameplate capacity was, and how that stacked up against our 1 event in 10-year load, making sure that we had enough capacity on the system such that we maintained our reliability criteria. And that typically, or not typically, but this is where the rule of thumb of 15% planning reserve margin came from above the 1 and 2 peak. What's key to understand about that system versus a future system is that we assumed that enough gas and enough coal would be available such that we'd be able to burn those fuels and produce energy for as long as we needed to, given generation that was online. what changes when we go into the future system is two things. One is first, nameplate is derated by the availability of renewable resources, and that availability changes day to day, season to season, just based on weather patterns. The other thing is that there are supporting technologies in this system that are either storing energy or they're large flexible loads in the system that may be energy constrained. So in the previous system, we never thought about energy constraints, that we would run out of energy. In the future system, that is one of the principal pieces of maintaining reliability, making sure that we have enough energy to be able to inject that into the system and maintain reliable operations, even when we have conditions where renewables may be offline, or not offline, but producing at very low output for several days. And also seasonally, when we have just less solar in the winter, and different wind variations over the course of the year as well, depending on geography. So what we have done to address this in our model is to basically run a planning reserve margin requirement on every single hour of the year. And that allows us to make sure that there is enough dependable capacity online and able to contribute during every different type of condition that we might encounter. The key to this is that the contribution is based on the dispatched energy for resources that are energy constrained. So things like storage only contribute their dispatched quantity in each hour. If you have a lithium-ion battery that has a 6-hour duration, it can contribute for 6 hours. But once it's out of charge, then it no longer contributes any dependable capacity towards the system. And so that allows us to capture that energy constrained dynamic in building out a reliable system. What we're factoring in here is demand side variations. So we gross up the load to higher than the sampled load in the model to account for load variations that we might not have in our data set. And then supply side availability, we're looking at outage rates, we're looking at renewable resource availability, we're looking at energy availability risk, which is what I just described as energy limited resources, and single largest contingencies. So we're using multiple years in the day sampling to add robustness. Our day sampling is looking for the worst conditions in the data set. And this has advantages over other pre-computed reliability assessments, because the challenge of reliability is really dependent on what type of resources you've invested in over time. And because this is a capacity expansion model, going from the system today to a fully net zero decarbonized system in the future, the conditions change significantly. And those conditions for reliability purposes are highly dependent on how much solar was built, how much wind was built, how much gas was built, all of these different elements. And so we've accounted for reliability endogenously inside of the model. The right-hand side chart here shows a snapshot from a previous study looking at October, 2 days, 16th of October and the 23rd of October. The black line is showing load plus the margin above that load to account for variability that we might not have in the data set. And so our dependable contribution from each resource has to sum up to more than that black line. And the dependable contribution is shown there for each resource. Red is the thermal supply, green is renewables, imports in gray, hydro in blue, and storage in yellow. On the 16th, we have a lot of renewable production. And we never actually have an hourly condition that sets the need for new capacity build, because that contribution from dependable capacity is always above the load plus margin line. On the 23rd, we have a lot less renewables. We also have lower loads as well. But you can see there's an hour in the evening and hours subsequent to that are setting the need for new capacity build, because our dependable contribution is exactly equal to the load plus margin. And this calculation is really dependent on how we derate every resource. What we do with loads is we scale them up to 106% of the load. Thermal resources, we derate them 80 to 95% just based on their forced outage rate. Renewable resources, 70 to 90% of hourly production. So this is hourly production in periods when we have very low renewable output already, say 10% of nameplate. We're derating that a further, say 30%. So we're taking 7% of nameplate as the contribution. Hydro, 95% of hourly production, energy storage, 95%. And imports and exports are dependent on contractual arrangements and N-1 contingencies. So those are set depending on the transmission connection. So I will open it up for questions on reliability.
There are none in the window at the moment, so I would keep going since I see where we are and where I know we have to go. So keep going.
Okay, so next section is kind of a reference section. There's a lot of information in here, and I'm not going to go through it all, but I'm just going to guide through where people should be looking. So first, on demand subsectors, this is the full list of the 67 subsectors that we're modeling in Energy Pathways. And the primary data sources we're using to build out this database include the annual Energy Outlook 2020 inputs and outputs from the EIA, the residential, the commercial buildings, and the manufacturing energy consumption surveys from the EIA. So how much each of those sectors and technologies associated with them are consuming. And the State Energy Data System SEDS to look at hourly profiles of consumption in different demand subsectors. And then the data that NREL provides on the demand side as well. We have 363 demand side technologies with projections of cost, capital installation, fuel switching, O&M, and service efficiency. Then for load shapes, what people are consuming, these are the sources for various different regions. So bulk system load, FERC form number 714. For the load shapes for all of these different technologies in the next section, we are looking at the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance stock assessment for the Northwest. In other regions, we have different sources like California Load Research Data for California, EPRI Load Shape Library. Then looking at residential side, AC, air conditioning, heating, heat pumps, etc. This is all also sourced from NREL and using weather data from NOAA. And then on the supply side, we have data characterizing research potential, resource potential, product costs, delivery infrastructure, and technology cost and performance. And there's a variety of sources here. The dominant sources, though, are from EIA and from NREL. So the technology cost and performance for various different types of electricity resource we can build are mostly sourced from the NREL annual technology baseline. One thing that is important to note here is that the various assumptions that we have on how loads will evolve and technology adoption are based on forecasts that are prior to COVID-19. And there's this question of impact on our study assumptions. How should we factor this in? What are the impacts long-term versus what are the impacts short-term? There's going to be changes to near-term adoption rates of new technologies. So what kind of shift should we make to the data to incorporate that? There'll probably be impacts on consumer spending for new appliances, vehicles. Will this accelerate action later? Will it delay electrification? Will there be opportunities for economic development in a post-COVID environment? Will there be stimulus to stimulate different development in different parts of the economy? And there'll be an impact on fuel prices. We see the major impact on oil prices currently based on the supply and demand imbalance. How is that going to play out over time? How do we see that impacting forecasted fuel prices going into the future? So I'll stop there for questions if there are any on that section.
None at this time.
Okay. So then key results, this is what we're taking out of the model that's going to inform the development of actions and policy in the next phase of the project. First, looking at annual net energy costs. One thing that is important in thinking about what kind of investments we're making and how much that's going to impact the economy is what we would have otherwise done. So in that respect, we're building a reference case or business as usual case where we contrast the investments that we make in a decarbonized scenario versus what we would otherwise have done in a case where we weren't decarbonizing. The way that we show that here is annual net energy costs. Everything above the $0 line here is investment in infrastructure or in fuels above and beyond what we would have invested in the reference case. And you can see that there's electricity grid, low carbon gen, a very large demand side equipment portion of this, which would be electric vehicles and heat pumps, etc. Biofuels plants, biomass. And then on the flip side, we're also avoiding investing in some of the things we would have otherwise invested in the reference case. And the dominant portion of this is gas, oil, and refined products. And that's shown on the negative side of the axis in gray. The difference between the summed positive and summed negative side is the black line, and that's the net cost increase over the reference case, which is what we're using to both assess the cost of decarbonizing and also assess one scenario or pathway against another. So what we'll see coming out of the analysis when we're running various different scenarios is contrasted costs that give us that economic counterpoint that we talked about earlier for each one of the scenarios that are developed to represent different policy directions for the state. And it's not necessarily that we're looking for the lowest cost option here. This is getting back to comparing or trading off different objectives in the state. This will allow us to put a dollar value to the costs or benefits of following a particular policy action versus another. And then what comes out of that is finding these least cost strategies that policy should target. And in the Northwest DDP, these are the ones that we came up with, and the total amounts of each one of these different categories. This will be dependent on the assumptions that go into the scenario development for the Washington State project. And then other key results are related to what we actually need to invest in, what we actually need to incentivize to happen on the demand side in sales of different types of technologies. This first results slide here is showing the decrease in final energy demand based on the assumptions on vehicle adoptions, on other types of technology adoption. The right-hand side there is showing vehicle adoptions over time. So the vehicle adoptions in percentage of annual sales on the left, and then final energy demand on the right resulting from those sales. And then electricity generation for each one of our scenarios will have different energy or electricity mixes in terms of generation. And that will feed into policy and action development on how we actually achieve that. What are the barriers to accomplishing that development of the electricity sector, and what types of near-term action will facilitate that development in the future. On the fuel side, we can look at the evolution of clean fuels in diesel, in jet fuel, in pipeline gas, and then think about how we might achieve that kind of level of decarbonization in the fuel sector. And then this final result is just looking big picture. We can, once we've developed our scenarios and we're looking at each one of them, we can contrast the actions taken in liquid fuels, the first two charts there on the left, gaseous fuels, the middle two charts, and electricity, the last two charts. The top charts there show energy demand. And if we take liquid fuels top left, we have transportation, liquid demand decreasing significantly. And at the same time, electricity demand on the top right is increasing in transportation from that electrification and displacement of liquid fuel using vehicles. On the bottom left, we see how we might meet the demand for those liquid fuels while also adhering to our emissions targets. We see biofuels coming in significantly by 2050 in the liquid fuels category. Similarly, for gas in the middle there, we see electric fuels displacing gas in pipeline by 2050. And then electricity demand is shown on the right, what we need to invest in to get to that increased electricity demand while meeting our emissions goals. And again, this is just an example pulled from the Northwest EDP study. We'll be building specific Washington state scenarios to look at the questions that we come up with or address through scenarios in the next workshop. And then finally in this section, cost impacts by sector, we can look at how much is being spent in each of the sectors by scenario. Any questions on that section?
Okay, we have two questions, but also just one statement about the availability of the slides. Yes, we will definitely be posting these slides, and they will be available on the Department of Commerce site, the part of the site where all of the state energy strategy related work is developed. From Dan Kirshner, how is the peak hour derived and contemplated in the model? You may have alluded to this, but it wasn't discussed explicitly.
So peak hour is based on the historical data that we have for the region. And when we're pooling the samples that we're running in the model, we're definitely pooling the highest gross load day or the highest gross load hour. And that's from 3 years of data for loads in the region. The peak hour becomes potentially less important as we go into the future, just because what we find is that the reliability criteria that really drive investment are these energy limited periods rather than the gross load peak itself. But we're definitely capturing both dynamics in those reliability criteria to drive investment, the peak or load shape, and the deficit of energy that comes from lack of renewables or low hydro conditions.
And then from one of the anonymous attendees, the avoided costs below the line look pretty similar, which makes sense. Given the changes in the petroleum economy, can you comment on the assumptions on those fuel costs out to 2050?
So this chart, I'm assuming, sorry, can you
This will
repeat the
probably
second
the-
half of the question there, Eileen?
So given the changes in the petroleum economy, can you comment on the assumptions on the fuel costs out to 2050?
Yeah, so this is quite an important assumption from a cost perspective, total cost of decarbonizing the economy. The cost that we avoid in buying these petroleum products is kind of a key component of how much that net cost is versus business as usual. The current events, COVID-19 and reduction in fuel prices, we need to think about how that impacts fuel costs long term, because long term is really what's important in looking at these kind of comparisons. From what I've seen, forecasts, at least the futures market for oil are recovering costs to pre-COVID levels by about 2022. But suggestions on what we could incorporate into fuel price assumptions, fuel price scenarios would be welcome. The other piece of that is that in history, fuel prices have been very volatile. And so we can look at what the cost ranges look like from a historical volatility perspective on total cost. But one of the potential advantages of decarbonizing the economy is that it kind of acts as a fuel hedge. In that in the past, we've had this great uncertainty about how much we're paying for energy. With a high renewable system, we basically reduce that variance. And so there's an element of that fuel hedge in building out a larger renewable energy economy.
Great, thank you. So at the moment, there are no other questions in the box. So we can move to the last set.
Okay. So final section here, this is just a look ahead to the next workshop and to tee up some of the things that we'll be talking about there. The first is the reference case. This doesn't meet the GHG targets. And by building this reference case and looking at the other decarbonization scenarios, we're asking the question, what would Washington do differently when meeting clean energy goals versus the status quo? There are a number of policies that are already in place in Washington, and CETA is one of the most impactful ones there, where our reference case will achieve the existing policies and hold them constant through 2050. We'll be achieving 100% clean electricity by 2045 in Washington. Then thinking about what scenario development means and investigating the state objectives. There are a lot of different policy constraints, assumptions, emissions constraints, etc., that go into defining a scenario. And our goal is to translate state objectives and potential policy pathways into constrained scenarios. So different types of policy, we try and translate them into assumptions about adoption of different technologies or constraints on how the supply side might be built out. And that helps us understand the trade-offs. How much does one pathway cost versus another? Provides this target for near-term policy and action design, and helps us understand those uncertainties if we're looking at, say, different potentials for building out renewables in the state. How does that impact the near-term decisions about what we invest in? Those kind of questions can be explored in designing our scenarios. In the next workshop, we'll be breaking down those components of a scenario and looking at what we're assuming in different straw man or proposed scenarios to investigate different policy or pathways. And these will be designed to incorporate feedback from initial discussions with the advisory committee, feedback from prior state proceedings on decarbonization. We'll summarize what the purpose of each scenario is and review the assumptions, and talk about how that interfaces with policy and action development. And then finally, I just want to touch on what happens after scenario development. So we'll be looking at running all of the different scenarios, developing these least regret strategies. What do we need to do in the near term? What kind of actions do we need to take to accomplish these goals in the context of decarbonizing over the long term? And that feeds into the policy development process, that question from up above, how should we get there, and creation of the state energy plan. So I will stop there and take any final questions.
Okay, we have some from the YouTube channel that we're going to turn to. Let's see. Electrification of transportation. Are you modeling endogenously the fuel choices for light duty, medium duty, heavy duty vehicles?
We are not endogenizing the decision on whether we electrify vehicles versus invest in diesel or invest in fuel cells. What we are doing is, if there is a demand for diesel or a demand for hydrogen in the transportation economy, the supply side optimization is working out what is the least cost way to serve that energy need while meeting the emissions objectives. And so if diesel were to remain in the economy, for example, then part of solving the supply side will be to work out first whether it is cost effective to decarbonize part of that, that diesel supply. And secondly, how decarbonizing that, or what is the least cost way of decarbonizing that diesel supply? And that might be building out synthetic fuels production. It might be allocation of biofuels. It could be importing biofuels from other places and paying the transportation costs to do that, or importing synthetic fuels from other places. So there's various different options that the model is optimizing across to be able to serve that energy need.
Okay, and to what degree do you compare your data sources to those used by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council for their analyses?
So we haven't compared our data. We are using public data sources for all of the generation, all of the transmission in the Western Interconnect. We can definitely look at the data sources that are being used and see how we match up with that. We tend to try and take the latest and most up-to-date version of the public databases that come out of NREL, come out of EPA, come out of EIA on what the electricity and energy system look like.
And I think I would also add that last summer, Gabe Kwok, who is another principal at Evolved Energy Research, and I briefed the council and there has been sort of data sharing and discussions back and forth between us and the council analysts. And we are also doing work in the state of Montana and involved with some of the Power Council folks who are working there as well. So there's definitely collaboration in that area, and we will definitely be connecting closely with the council through this work as well. Okay, see, there's another one from Dan Kirshner. Will proposed scenarios be predicated on prior studies or otherwise predefined, or is it open for discussion?
It's open for discussion. We will come to the next workshop with proposed scenarios that are not based on past work, but based on the discussions that we've had with the advisory committee and with previous groups in Washington State and in Northwest, where there have been suggestions on interesting policy tracks that Washington could take. And so that'll be a starting point for developing the scenarios that we ultimately go forward with.
Okay, and let's see. I don't see any other ones for Jeremy. Jessica, I'm going to respond to you. Anything else? Wow, we're 20 minutes early. Everybody gets 20 minutes back. Is there any other? Questions? Okay. Tom or Andy, should we close up then, or Kate or anybody from Commerce or Governor's team?
Yeah, Eileen, this is Tom. Nothing more from me, other than to thank folks for participating on the webinar and those who followed along on the YouTube channel. Anything from Commerce or the Governor's office?
Hi, this is Glenn Blackman, and from the Department of Commerce. I will, since we got a little time, there were a couple of other questions that just came in over the YouTube platform that I'll toss them to Jeremy now, just to see what we could do, what he could do with those. So one is, how do the models, or how do you model the competition of land use for food versus energy crops? Do you
Yeah,
want to?
sure. Yeah. So the potential for biomass that we use is the DOE billion ton study, and that doesn't include energy crops. It's looking at mostly waste products and wood products, and so that's the competition with food crops is not an issue when we're using that particular input set for biofuels. There's definitely a competition that we can look at in more detail between potentially natural emissions reductions measures that we can take where we're changing land use to reduce emissions in Washington State. And that's something that we're discussing in setting up the analysis. And there's also competition in siting renewables and building out renewables in the state and those types of resource. And so both of those will be factored into the analysis. When we're looking at potential for new renewable resources, those are based on NREL potential studies that are limiting development areas based on what their current land use is. But some of that is it could be used for other things. And so in writing up the study, we can discuss those kinds of trade-offs.
Okay, and then another question from there was, to what degree do you think that this modeling and analysis effort can inform decisions at the utility level where most of the infrastructure investment is made?
So on the electricity side, this is one of the areas of reaching the targets where we have a more tried and true model. You know, on the demand side, we're trying to incentivize customers potentially to do things in a different way or invest in different types of infrastructure or technologies. On the electricity side, there's been a established planning process for a long time. And so this can be a direct input into those planning processes to identify what types of target we might need to meet on the electricity side. What kind of expansion might we expect based on electrification of the demand side? And what types of development should we be identifying or trying to procure on the electricity side? So I think there's definitely a direct connection between those, but the capacity expansion modeling and deep decarbonization modeling is not a substitute for the more detailed modeling that happens in utility planning, thinking about power flow modeling for reliability, for transmission expansion, and more detailed reliability modeling, looking at loss of load probability and how much needs to be invested in on that side of things. And so what we're doing is quite complementary to all of those planning activities that happen at the utility.
Jeremy, we had another one from Clay also, although Glenn, I don't know if there are any other ones from YouTube. I'm not seeing those. Is there anything else?
Not recently.
Okay. Clay asks, if Washington were to take actions that help jumpstart the electric fuels industry, would the model be able to capture the impact of those early actions in later cost reductions?
Yes, we can. We can definitely incorporate a reduced cost trajectory for those types of technologies. What I would wonder, though, is whether, as a state, Washington could produce cost reductions in those areas, just because research and development, though, would be very valuable in Washington State. What's more likely to reduce costs in those areas is the global research community all working on that issue. And so I don't know if there is a strong direct connection between increased research dollars and cost reductions in particular parts of the economy. There may well be specific technologies that would respond well to, and we could factor that into a scenario that's looking at accelerated cost reductions.
Okay. Great. I think that that's it for the questions. I will remind everybody that there will be a second webinar next on the 27th of May. It's actually the same time slot, which was not planned, but it'll be 10 to noon. And in that webinar, we're going to be presenting draft scenarios and describing how they can be used to inform the selection of policy and actions to include in the Washington State 2021 Energy Strategy. So we got a little preview of that, but we'll go into that with much greater detail, as Jeremy mentioned. And all slides will be posted, as I mentioned before, up on the Commerce website. And so I think that's all, other than to say thank you so very much and to thank you for all of the excellent questions. And if you continue to have questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And especially if you are, once you get the slides and have a chance to sit with them and think about them and have additional questions, please do not hesitate to let us know. And then Dan asked a question about how will you contribute to the discussion of the draft scenarios? That's going to be the focus. First, we'll introduce some strawman scenarios at the March 27 webinar, and then we will be in discussion with the advisory committee about that. We also will have the technical advisors who will be helping us frame, and then at I believe at the June 11 advisory committee meeting, we would also be devoting to that. So there'll be a variety of opportunities to engage in helping draft the scenarios. Okay, with that, thank you all very much. Really appreciate the engagement, and thank you for the opportunity to work with you. Guess I turn this over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and we'll close things out. Thanks, Eileen
Okay.
and Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone.